The Quiet Panic. You guys have been absolutely flooding my comments asking for more late-night horror stories. And trust me, I've been digging through everything I could find. What I discovered will genuinely make you think twice before answering your door after the sun goes down. It was supposed to be just another quiet Tuesday night. I was 23, living alone in this tiny apartment on the second floor of an old building downtown. The kind of place where the rent was cheap because the heating barely worked and you could hear your neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls. But hey, it was mine. And after years of sharing cramped dorm rooms, having my own space felt like luxury. I'd just finished binge-watching some Netflix series until around 11:30 when I decided to call it a night. The building was finally quiet for once. No screaming kids upstairs, no loud music from the unit next door. Just the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my front door. Now I know what you're thinking. People knock on doors all the time, right? But here's the thing. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday. Who the hell visits someone at midnight on a Tuesday? I stood there in my bathroom, toothbrush still in my mouth, listening. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the building settling or something from upstairs. Then it came again. 3 more knocks, same rhythm, same volume. Definitely someone at my door. I rinsed my mouth and walked to the front door as quietly as possible. My apartment had one of those old-school peepholes, the kind that gives you a fisheye view of the hallway. I pressed my eye against it and looked out. The hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb that the landlord never bothered to replace. But I could see well enough. There was nobody there. Absolutely nobody. The hallway was empty, stretching in both directions toward the stairwells. I stood there for a full minute, just watching, waiting to see if someone would step back into view. Nothing. Just that annoying flickering light casting weird shadows on the faded carpet. I figured maybe some drunk person had knocked on the wrong door and wandered off when they realized their mistake. It happened sometimes in buildings like mine where all the doors looked identical. I shrugged it off and headed back to my bedroom. That's when the knocking started again. This time it was different. Not 3 polite knocks, but a steady rhythm that went on for what felt like forever. Knock, 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 knock. Like someone was impatiently drumming their fingers against my door. I grabbed my phone to check the time. 12:15 in the morning. I crept back to the peephole, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Again, the hallway was completely empty. But the knocking continued, echoing through my apartment like it was coming from inside the walls themselves. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to figure out where the sound was actually coming from. The knocking stopped. Dead silence. I waited there, ear pressed against the cold metal door for probably 5 minutes. Just when I was starting to think it was over, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Scratching, like fingernails being dragged slowly down the other side of my door. Now I was genuinely scared. I grabbed my phone and did what any reasonable person would do. I called the police. The dispatcher was professional but clearly annoyed. Apparently, mysterious knocking doesn't qualify as an emergency unless there's an actual threat being made. She told me to call back if the person actually tried to break in or if I felt I was in immediate danger. Great. So I was on my own. The scratching continued for another few minutes, then stopped. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch with a kitchen knife in my lap, jumping at every little sound. When morning finally came, I worked up the courage to open my door and check the hallway. There were scratch marks on my door, deep gouges in the paint that definitely hadn't been there before. But here's what really freaked me out. The scratches were too high up, like way too high. I'm 5'8", and these marks were a good 6 inches above where my head would reach if I stood on my tiptoes. I asked my neighbors if they'd heard anything. Mrs. Chen from across the hall said she'd been up late watching TV, but hadn't heard any knocking. The college kids downstairs claimed they'd been passed out drunk since 10. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. Just me and whatever had been scratching at my door in the middle of the night. I thought maybe that was the end of it. One weird night, probably just some tall drunk person or maybe someone on drugs. These things happen in the city, right? I even convinced myself that maybe the scratch marks had been there all along and I just hadn't noticed them before. But 3 nights later, it happened again. This time I was ready. I'd borrowed a baseball bat from my buddy Marcus and had my phone set to speed dial 911. When the knocking started at exactly midnight, I was waiting by the door with my eye pressed to the peephole. The hallway was empty just like before. But the knocking was more aggressive this time, like someone was pounding on the door with their fist. I could feel the vibrations through the floor. Then I heard something that nearly made me drop the bat. A voice, muffled like someone was speaking through a thick cloth, but definitely human. It was calling my name. "David," it said. "David, I know you're in there." How did it know my name? I'd lived in this building for 8 months and half my neighbors didn't even know what I looked like, let alone my name. The voice continued, getting louder and more insistent. "David, open the door. I just want to talk to you." I pressed my face against the peephole so hard it left a mark on my forehead. Still nobody there. The voice was coming from right outside my door, but there was absolutely no one in that hallway. I started recording on my phone, thinking maybe I could capture evidence of whatever was happening. "David, don't make me wait out here all night. You know what I want." But I didn't know what it wanted. I had no idea what was happening or why this thing, whatever it was, had decided to torment me. The voice kept calling my name for another 10 minutes, sometimes pleading, sometimes demanding, sometimes almost singing it like a lullaby. Then, just like the night before, everything went silent. I stayed awake until dawn, bat in hand, waiting for it to come back. When the sun finally rose, I opened my door to find fresh scratch marks, even deeper than before. This time they formed a pattern, almost like letters, but nothing I could read. That's when I knew I had to get out of that apartment. Whatever was visiting me at midnight wasn't going to stop, and it was getting bolder each time. I started making plans to break my lease, crash at friends' places, anything to get away from that building. But breaking a lease takes time, and paperwork and money I didn't have. So for the next week, I had to endure the nightly visits. Each night at exactly midnight, the knocking would start. Each night the voice would call my name, and each morning I'd find new scratch marks on my door, getting more elaborate and more disturbing. By the end of that week, I was barely sleeping, jumping at every sound, constantly looking over my shoulder. My coworkers started asking if I was feeling okay. My friends stopped inviting me out because I'd become this paranoid, exhausted mess who flinched every time someone knocked on a door. But the worst part wasn't the lack of sleep or the constant fear. The worst part was what happened on the 7th night, when I finally worked up the courage to do something I should have done from the beginning. I decided to actually answer the door. I know that sounds insane, but I was at my breaking point. 7 nights of this psychological torture had pushed me past rational thinking. I figured whatever was out there couldn't be worse than the constant dread and sleepless nights. At least if I confronted it, I'd finally know what I was dealing with. So when midnight rolled around and the knocking started, I walked straight to the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the deadbolt. The voice started its usual routine, calling my name in that muffled, sing-song tone. But this time, instead of hiding behind the door like a coward, I took a deep breath and spoke back. "What do you want from me?" The knocking stopped instantly. The voice went quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd scared it away just by responding. Then I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. Laughter. Not human laughter. This was something else entirely. It started as a low chuckle and built into this horrible, wheezing cackle that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. I pressed my eye to the peephole again, and that's when I saw it. There was still nobody in the hallway, but the shadows were moving. They were flowing along the walls like liquid, gathering near my door, forming shapes that almost looked like a person but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with appendages that bent in ways that human limbs shouldn't bend. "David," the voice said clearer now, like whatever was speaking had moved closer to the door. "I've been waiting so long for you to talk to me. Who are you? What do you want?" "I want to come inside, David. I want to show you something wonderful." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to barricade the door, to do anything except continue this conversation. But I was trapped in my own apartment with nowhere to go, and this thing seemed to know exactly who I was and where I lived. "I'm not opening this door," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The laughter came again, even louder this time. The shadows in the hallway began moving faster, swirling around like a tornado made of darkness. "Oh, David. Sweet, naive David. Who said anything about you opening the door?" That's when I heard the sound that still haunts my nightmares. The slow, metallic scraping of my deadbolt turning. I watched in absolute terror as the lock began to move on its own, rotating slowly counterclockwise. I lunged forward and grabbed it, trying to hold it in place, but some invisible force was working against me. The deadbolt clicked open. I threw my full weight against the door, pressing my back against it, digging my heels into the floor. But I could feel something pushing from the other side. Something with strength that made my efforts feel pathetic. The door began to inch open despite everything I was doing to keep it closed. "Don't fight it, David. This will be so much easier if you just let me in." Through the growing crack in the door, I could see those shadows pouring into my apartment like smoke. They filled the room surrounding me, and suddenly the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs as I continued to struggle against the door. That's when I felt it. Something cold and wet touched the back of my neck. I spun around and there it was. I can't really describe what I saw because it kept changing, shifting between forms like it couldn't decide what shape to take. Sometimes it looked almost human, a tall figure in tattered clothing. Other times it was just a mass of writhing shadows with eyes that glowed like dying embers. But the worst part was its face, or what passed for a face. It was like looking at a reflection in broken glass, fractured and wrong, with too many teeth and not enough skin. "Hello, David," it said, and its voice came from everywhere at once. "Aren't you going to invite me in properly?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear, as this thing circled around me like a predator sizing up its prey. It reached out with what might have been a hand and touched my cheek with fingers that felt like icicles. "I've been watching you for so long," it whispered. "Ever since you moved into this building. Did you really think you were alone here? Did you think this place was just empty hallways and quiet neighbors?" The thing laughed again, and the sound made my teeth ache. "This building has so many residents you've never met, David. We live in the spaces between the walls, in the shadows under the stairs, in the corners where the light never reaches. And we've been so curious about our new neighbor." It leaned closer, and I could smell something like rotting flowers and burnt metal. "But don't worry, we're not going to hurt you, we just want to play." That's when I snapped out of my paralysis and ran. I bolted for my bedroom, slammed the door, and barricaded it with my dresser. I could hear that thing moving around my apartment, opening cabinets, turning on the TV, running water in the sink. It was making itself at home. I called 911 from my closet, whispering into the phone about an intruder in my apartment. The dispatcher said officers were on their way, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. How do you arrest a shadow? How do you handcuff something that doesn't seem to have a physical form? Sure enough, when the police arrived 20 minutes later, they found my apartment empty. The front door was locked, all the windows were secure, and there was no sign of forced entry. They looked at me like I was having some kind of breakdown, which honestly wasn't far from the truth. But I knew what I'd experienced was real. The scratch marks on my door were real. The feeling of those ice-cold fingers on my face was real. And most importantly, the thing's promise that this was just the beginning was real. I moved out the next day, broke my lease, lost my security deposit, didn't care. I crashed on my friend Marcus's couch for a month while I found a new place on the other side of town. I thought I'd escaped, thought I'd left whatever was haunting that building behind. But 3 weeks after I moved into my new apartment, I was settling in for the night when I heard something that made my blood freeze. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my front door. It was exactly midnight. I've learned since then that some things don't stay tied to a single location. Some things attach themselves to people, following them wherever they go. And once they've decided they want to play with you, distance doesn't matter. New addresses don't matter. Locked doors definitely don't matter. So here's my advice, and I'm deadly serious about this. If someone knocks on your door after midnight and you can't see anyone through the peephole, don't answer it. Don't even acknowledge it, because once you let them know you're listening, once you give them that first response, they'll never stop coming back. Trust me on this one. Some games you don't want to play, and some visitors you definitely don't want to meet. The darkness has its own rules, and if you're not careful, you might find yourself playing by them whether you want to or not. Sweet dreams, everyone, and remember, when that midnight knocking starts, just pretend you're not home.